Hello and welcome everybody from the Asia Pacific region. Looking at my time and when this is supposed to come out, good afternoon everybody, I suppose. It's very, very early for me in the morning and for Gianni as well, as we're both sitting in Switzerland, which is why this is a recorded presentation and you can send in your questions afterwards and we will answer them. Today's topic is about Oracle Analytics, and more specifically about the security in Oracle Analytics. And we'll cover literally anything there is to know about these security solutions in Oracle Analytics, which are quite diverse, as you will see in a moment. Let's start off. First of all, as Yoda used to say, do or do not. There is no try. And that holds especially true for security. You don't improvise security, you do it or you don't do it. This is, after all, your corporate data that you're analyzing. So with that little joke out of the way, my name is Berg. I'm an Oracle ACE director for business analytics. I'm doing this since almost 20 years now, everything about data warehousing, data engineering, analytics, etc., etc. I've been a speaker all over the world, Open World, Kscope, different user groups from Oracle, but also more open source stuff like the Riga Dev Days. Sometimes I can be bothered to blog, not really often, but most of the time you will find me on the developer community forums from Oracle or on our own OBIEE Hackers channel on Telegram. I'm also a co-founder of the Aces at Home webinar series, and I'm in pretty frequent contact with Oracle product management for everything that goes on in the whole analytics space of the Oracle products. My co-presenter today is Gianni Ceresa. And Gianni, please go ahead, introduce yourself to the crowd.
Yes, so I'm Gianni. I also live in Switzerland. I'm doing this job for about 10 and more years now. So it's very similar to Christian, but younger, kind of. I also have my own blog where I can write from time to time. Again, spending a lot of time on the forums, a lot of time on various user groups. With Christian, we co-founded the Aces at Home. And as him, I keep giving feedbacks to project managers. That's it about me.
All right, thanks so much, Gianni. So today is being cut in two. I'll do the first half of the presentation, and Gianni will then kick in for the second half. So first of all, you'll notice already this whole thing is being organized by the APAC community, so APAC OUC, which is also being staffed by a lot of Oracle ACE directors, groundbreakers, etc., etc. The ACE program is basically something that lives and dies with the peers in the community. So if you want to participate, this is really very important. If you want to participate, please do. Nominate people that you think would be good for the ACE program. Ask people to nominate yourself if you would like to join the program. And yeah, growing this community is what gets the community going a lot of times in places where there's not much activity, or, well, get together and have some fun. Trust me, once this whole situation is over, we will have in-person meetings again. So now, security. We're going to cover a couple of topics. And first of all, a global context from my end, because just like with the project plan and the project definition, what we're going to talk about is as important as what we're not going to talk about. Then I'm quickly going to show you which products and areas of the product we're going to cover. And then we're going to dive in, and this is the huge main core of the presentation, the security concepts themselves, and then something more specific to cloud, the identity cloud service, added to this whole thing. Right, so context. First of all, if you're talking about Oracle Analytics security, two words come to mind: vast and complex. And just for fun, I typed this into Google recently, and the first thing that came out is, I mean, obviously location-based, is a diagram and a layout of the CERN's Hadron Colliders and all the accelerator which is pretty much as vast and as complex as you can get. Now, don't be scared, Oracle Analytics Security isn't that complex, but it's much more complex than you might think. So again, in terms of context, if we look at other analytical platform tools from other competitors, there's always something that you can choose. And I abbreviated this with easy versus better. And easy for me means you got less options, it's very high level, it's either on or off, and you got a departmental or user focus, and that's it. So this is what most people and most tools out there do. Versus what we have on the Oracle side, some people say, well, it's actually too many options. I like having many options. I like controlling every single object or entity there is. And that means whether it's a content, whether it's data, whether it's metadata, whatever. I want it to be configurable. I don't want it to be set in stone. I want to be able to change this on the fly whenever I want. And then obviously in terms of security, I don't want this to be just the department I work with or these couple of users that I work with. I want this for the whole corporation, for our third-party stakeholders, for the department and the users, for everybody that actually touches these systems. Now, historically, we've come quite a long way here with these products. So we started with a company called NQuire back in 1997, who wrote the core of the Oracle Analytics server. So most of the things that you see when you have on-premises Oracle Analytics and that you still have in the background when you're doing Oracle Analytics in the cloud, they wrote that stuff more than 20 years ago. And that's the core that everything's built on. Now, along came Siebel, who basically bought the whole shebang because they wanted to have a marketing segmentation engine. They added things like the action framework, so sending out agents, integrating it into your, for example, Siebel CRM or Oracle eBusiness. And they added more and more extensions to the sources, so new source systems. Oracle bought the whole thing in 2006, and since then we've added tons and tons and tons and tons of functionality. So obviously stuff like BI Publisher, web services, MBeans, the whole WebLogic backend, Essbase, and now with the newest versions, everything around data visualization, augmented analytics, data engineering, data flows. So with this context set, in terms of history, let's look at what products are we actually talking about here, because there's quite some out there, and we're going to cover Oracle Business Intelligence. Current version is 12.2.1.4, and the successors of Oracle Business Intelligence, which is once Oracle Analytics Cloud and Oracle Analytics Server, so the on-premises platform solution that is replacing OBIEE. If you're on older versions like 11G or so, don't worry, 99% of the, well, not 99, maybe 80% of the presentation is still valid for you, except for everything that obviously ties to data visualization and data engineering, because that just doesn't exist before the 12c family. All right, so these are the main products that we're talking about. And in that, we have the basic security concept, as I said initially. Then we'll talk about the transfer and transformation of a corporate security environment into an application security environment. So for example, your Microsoft Active Directory, your LDAP, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to look at which parts are in the back end, which parts are in the front end. And then obviously for all of these things, details, 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 details. There's a lot of stuff coming here. And how deep can we go with this? Well, very, very deep. For this session, we're going to keep it down to 45, 50 minutes of presentation time. First of all, so not to mess up the schedule of the APAC OEC, but also it's a more digestible format. We could do this literally for a one-day workshop and yeah, only then give you a real proper detailed introduction to all the security. Now, let's directly jump into the security concepts that we're going to cover here. So first of all, very, very simplified. You have this black box here on the screen, and imagine this black box is your security. Now, security sounds, especially in analytics, most of the time it sounds very easy. Oh, I wanna secure a certain table. I want to secure a certain data source. This is the kind of things that people know when they're coming from an SQL or databasing background. All right, I give rights on the table, I give rights on the data, I give rights to a schema, etc., etc. But an analytical platform is much, 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 much more than that. First of all, you don't have just one source. You can have 100 sources. You can have different sources like EBS, Essbase, Hadoop storage, some kind of JSON, anything. Now, if we look at it very, very basically, when you get in, first of all, you're authenticated. Are you who you say you are? Then you get access to some components of the system, meaning which parts are you allowed to access? Many times you do have full functional access and component access because you're the admin. But do you want to give this to every single user of your system? Probably not. You're going to overload them. Likewise, do you want to give them functional access to every single thing there is? Again, probably not. Many functions in the system are very elaborate and very, very advanced, so you probably want to train them before you give them access. You don't want them to be able to take down the whole system with some weird query they're running or some export. Hey, Excel, we want to cut this down. Then, if we go into more of the metadata area, object level access. Should they even have access to all the metadata objects there are? Probably not. Not everybody should have access to your HR information. Not everybody should be able to do reporting on personal information of the employees or personal information of your end clients, most likely. Some data analysts, sure, they need this, but not everybody in your corporation. Then metadata level access. Inside of, for example, your HR data, should we see salary? Well, if you're the line manager, probably yeah. If you're an employee and you're looking at stuff from your other colleagues in the department, probably no. And data level access, that literally cuts through everything that we just said. So should there be data level filters applied? For example, your products that you're responsible for. My salary, yes, I'm allowed to see. I'm not allowed to see the salary of my coworker, but I'm allowed to see the salary of my subordinates. Should I be allowed to see other business units? Should I be allowed to see stakeholders that actually feed data into our system, like third-party providers? So even if you simplify things, you can see there's a lot of pieces that make up this whole black box, this whole cube that just says security. And very simplified in terms of the principles that we have one, we have users, we have groups, and we have application roles. Those are the three main terminologies that you need to keep in mind when you're talking about security for everything that's related to Oracle Analytics. Now, users can belong to groups, and groups can have recursive relationships. Users and groups are mapped to application roles, which in themselves can have recursive relationships, so inheritance. And this is basically in terms of the principles. That's it. And if you have worked with things like an LDAP or MSAD already, you will notice this is your daily bread, basically. Right. And since I mentioned earlier versions before, just in case you're on 10G or even something older than this, there was something called catalog groups. They do not exist anymore. If you are still on such an old version that you have this, please upgrade as soon as possible, because it will pose problems if you go to the newest versions, and this just isn't there anymore. So this out of the way, let's start with the first of these building blocks for the security principles that we talked about. Authentication. Am I allowed to go through the door? Am I who I claim to be? Now, If we look on the left side of the screen, Oracle Business Intelligence and Oracle WebLogic Server, this is what we had since the first release of 11G way back when in 2008. So WebLogic Server does the security for us. That's the security backend. Oracle Analytics Server, which is the new on-premises version of OBIEE, uses the same thing. So if you're staying on premises and you're going to a newer version of Oracle Analytics, you can use the same functionality that you had before. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the screen with Oracle Analytics Cloud, things are a little bit different because, yes, in the background, you still have a WebLogic server running, but your actual security background is managed by IDCS, so by the Identity Cloud Service. Gianni will cover this later. So moving on. Generally, what the Oracle WebLogic Server does for OBIEE or Oracle Analytics Server. Whether your security is in database tables, or in an LDAP, or an Active Directory, the WebLogic Server combines all of these sources, then also has its own embedded and integrated LDAP. And here you can have your users and your groups. So they can either come from database tables, LDAP, or MSID, or you can manually manage them inside of your WebLogic LDAP. I mean, obviously, if you have a standalone system, WebLogic LDAP is something that you can do, but in 99.9% of the cases, you will have something like a corporate Active Directory. You will have something like a corporate LDAP because you want to have one version of the truth for your data, but also one version of the truth for your security. You don't want to have 50 securities managed. Also, you want to do stuff like single sign-on. And hence, if you start balkanizing this, it's never a good idea. Now, this combines everybody into WebLogic principles of type user and group. If you have a table and an Active Directory, and you have users in both for WebLogic, and then all the applications, namely Oracle Analytics afterwards, this becomes one user, which is a merge of all the other users coming from your database table and Active Directory. And from there, we actually go to the application world, which means, in this case, to OBIEE/Oracle Analytics. So with this whole corporate versus application that I said before, the top layer is basically your corporate structured security world. Whereas in the lower level, that's where we go into the application. And that's where things become interesting for applying security to data, to analytical objects, to analytical functions, etc., etc. So a little bit of a backend versus front end. Basically, we have the structural baseline, which is either WebLogic Server or Oracle IDCS for the cloud, versus the front end, which is OBIEE, Oracle Analytics Server, or Oracle Analytics Cloud. And those basically apply the security to actual usage, to metadata objects, to analytics, to content, to dashboards, to data visualization projects, etc. So they productize the security. Before it's just a structure, and afterwards it's an actual applied tool. So now moving forward, component access. So just like, all right, am I allowed to get through the door? The question becomes, which part of the platform am I actually allowed to use? So if we look at OBIEE and OAS, in Enterprise Manager, we have the application policies who give us access to this. But inside of OBIEE and OAS, we have the application administration. The reason for that twofold approach is historical, basically how this whole thing was built, how historically it was grown. Now, you need to keep these things in mind because imagine you already have a running system. You upgrade from, for example, 11G to the newest OAS. All of a sudden, new things come along like data visualization, data engineering, data mashups, etc., etc. And you need to give access to this. So are people allowed to use parts of this, these parts of the platform? When you migrate, obviously, you want to keep the old security, but you need to add the new one as well. So keep this in mind. And for cloud, again, it's IDCS, where you need to manage many of those things. As for so many other things concerning Oracle Analytics security, never think there's just one single place. Think back to the initial black box of security that we had. There are so many different things surrounding security, there's no one place to manage them. Right, so the application roles, that's the main vehicle that you use, and you should use, please, for managing stuff like application policies, so access to certain components and functionalities. Very simple reason. These application roles are normally topic-oriented. They're for normally a matrix organization. So you have functional access and you have organizational access. For example, you're a business analyst in HR, or you're a department manager in logistics. So you create a matrix organization. And through these roles, you get access to functions, components, data, etc., etc. Don't try to go down to the user. You will end up with tens of thousands of rules that nobody can manage anymore. Stay on the application role. Coming back to quickly what I said before, the application policies. So this is where we structurally assign rights to certain parts of the application. For example, as you can see down here, am I allowed to run a BI Publisher report? Am I allowed to run a BI Publisher Excel export, etc., etc.? So a couple of things are already managed here. So the application policy is really important, and I'm repeating that especially for people that come from older versions. Don't forget this when you migrate. You could create a system where half of the people don't have access to things that you want them to have access to. So, functional access. Now, we had component access on a very high level. Functional access inside of OBIEE and OAS is as it used to be in the application administration itself. Cloud has its own console, which works together with IDCS. More on that later. So now the functional access, on a very high level, we have said, right, you're allowed to be an analytics user, or you're allowed to be a BI Publisher user. But now we can go into details. Does a certain user have access to dashboards? Does a certain user have access to, for example, the administration screen? Is he allowed to work with delivers, so sending out content via agents? And this is all managed here, and we can be very, very fine-grained here. And again, normally, you should grant this to application roles. Don't go to user, you will lose yourself in this. You can, it will list them, and you can assign them, and it will work, but you will probably miss something somewhere. Then, if we go further with the functional access, because here we have a hybrid situation, functional and data access, because it can be the case that you're allowed to consume prefabricated output either by some specialist analyst, some data scientist, or your IT department. You're allowed to consume it, what's prefabricated, but you're not allowed to build your own analysis, your own reports on top of that. So for each of our subject areas which present data to us, which present topical data to us, we can then say who is allowed to build new content on top of these things and then share it with others, which is, it's a very neat feature. So if we look about functional access as a whole, we check which detailed functions are we allowed to use, dashboards, answers, agents, etc., etc. And then also with data security as a combination, which subject area are we allowed to create content on? Which area are we allowed to use in those functionalities that have been exposed to us? Very important here, if we just go back one slide, It's basically, it's granted or denied. There is no in between. It's 0 or 1. But in case of doubt, the deny will win here. So if you put an explicit deny on any function, you can have 50 other grants that implicitly would give you this. It won't work. It will actually kick you out because you're on the highest level, you're on the functional level of access, and there's no other check on top of this. So that's the reason why here the deny wins. Gianni will cover it in a moment, but later on, the grant wins because up to the top you have more different options, and actually killing your access would be too restrictive. And then also a word of advice, because we have seen this in projects already, and we like to put things in these presentations where we had clients pay dearly for these errors, and we don't want you people out there to repeat them. Pay attention to something that's called authenticated user. It's a system-defined role that exists where you can add grants to this, you can give functional access to this, but pay attention. This means every single person that's authenticated and can use the system. Meaning that even if you give access to, for example, a third party in your value chain of the corporation, like a supplier or a client in your production chain, they will have access to this too. Even if you implicitly only want to give them access to certain remote areas where they can see some overview dashboards or so, if you give an actual privilege or functional access to the system or authenticated user, everybody has it, even the people from outside of your org. Careful. So with this, I will hand over to Gianni for the second part of the presentation. Gianni?
Yeah. So I'm just stealing the screen from you. Okay, so here we are. Christian just went over the functional privileges, the functional permission that you have. What about the content? What about the objects that you can create? What about all the dashboards, all the analysis that you can develop? These kind of objects, you have to go to the object level, so it's in the catalog. OBIEE, it's using the catalog for ages. Oracle Analytics Server, Oracle Analytics Cloud, they still have the catalog. Now it just moved somewhere else, like it's stored in the database and not just on the file system, but as a detail. And there inside, you really have all the folders. You have all your objects inside the folders, and it's extremely similar to a file system permission. Like when on your Windows, on your Linux, you set permission on your folders and files, that's the same thing, similar as the catalog, how it works. So the kind of permission you can set are extremely detailed. It's not just allow, deny, grant, or deny. It's really just extremely detailed. You go down to the read, traverse, write, delete, change permission, set ownership. And then there are also some permission which are explicit things for publisher, like running, scheduling, and viewing publisher content. When you set this permission, is the same thing as the functional ones. You set them either at the application role level or at the user level. Once again, try to stay away from permission set to the user, just because it's a nightmare. You will never ever remember which user is allowed to do what. Stick to your application roles, that's what they are there for. And when you start creating permission in the catalog, there are some predefined set of permissions that can make your life easier. Those predefined set is the no access, traverse, open, modify, full control. And in this table, you can see just what they mean. By using this predefined, I would say, set of permissions, you can already do a really good job. Obviously, you can also go to custom and set every single one of those detailed permission one by one as much as you want. So another detail to keep in mind, no access always win. And that's really important because every once in a while, mainly the forum, there is always somebody coming in, hey, I have the WebLogic account, I'm the admin of my system, I cannot access the catalog anymore. Yeah, you set a no access somewhere to a specific application role, but because of inheritance, your WebLogic account inherited that role. So you inherit the no access as well. No access wins. You can be admin as much as you want. If you set a no access and you inherit that one, you're out. As simple as that. Okay, there are still ways to recover the permission and to fix it. So it's not like you didn't lose your server, but still keep in mind that no access really means no access, as simple as that. And in other conditions, when you don't set a real no access, but you just stay on read, traverse, write, those things, it's really an addition of roles. Like if one application role give me the write permission, another application role give me the read and open permission, I will end up having a write permission, not a read only. So it's really like the most powerful one, the one giving me the most option is the one that win in that case, except for the no access. I'm really repeating this one because no access really mean no access, as simple as that. What about data visualization? So this fully new interface that you have in OAC, OAS, or even in OBIEE 12c. Well, this one works in a bit on a different way. So when you open a project in data visualization, you don't have as many permissions as that. You just have a read, write, read only. It's really as simple as that. It's really a higher level of permission. You cannot go down to every single fine-grained permissions like the catalog itself. So keep in mind that aspect. Also because DV originally came for the self-service approach, so it was a lot more like user-oriented and not corporate-oriented. And what about datasets? That's even more special because a dataset in DV is a kind of a mix. It's not really it's not data, it's not a connection, or just not only a connection. It's not a content object, it's not a project. It's this kind of hybrid option in between the two. So you have a kind of similar permission. You have the read and write, read only, and you also have a full control one. And it's really challenging. So really, please pay attention to what permission you set to your data visualization project, to your data visualization data sets, and so on. Now, going back to the RPD, if you know the RPD, you know that it's the full metadata of your analytical platform. There inside, we also have permissions. So the RPD gives you the metadata-level access. If we take the presentation layer, the one where you define the subject areas, where you define tables, and then you store the columns that you want to expose to the users into these tables, you can really go there inside and give detailed permission, detailed as much as read and write, which is for the write back and require also set up in the business logical model. And you can also set no access when you don't want to expose a column to somebody. For example, if you have HR information, you maybe don't want to expose a salary and these kind of things. You maybe just want to allow everybody to see name, first name, email, but the salary of the people, you want to keep it only for the HR manager. So the no access can really be helpful at a RPD presentation layer level. And just to make things a bit more complicated, in this case, read is stronger than no access. So object level in the catalog, no access was the one winning every single time. In the RPD presentation layer, read is stronger than no access. This is the challenging bit, and you really have to pay attention of where you are because it's just the opposite. So don't start thinking, oh, no access, it's always wins. Nope, no access is not as strong as that in the RPD. And because of this mix between the RPD, the data, the web catalog, and also the privileges that Christian was showing, the subject areas permission inside the front end, you can have a mix of the RPD let you go through, but then the front end hide or cut things out, and you are not allowed to do things. There is a detail, something special in the RPD when you set permissions, is the default. You can set the read, write, no access, and then you have the default, which is always set by default. I mean, it's its name. Everything has the default permission by default. I'm repeating default many times, but that's the name it has. And there is a special behavior on this one. If you are on a subject area level, default mean take the same permission as authenticated user. This system-defined application role, which always exists. And if you look at the screenshot, you see that the authenticated role is the only one without the default checkbox. So authenticated user must have a real permission, and then everything else can say default. Yeah, I just copy authenticated user. But when you go down to, for example, tables or columns, presentation tables, presentation columns, default means take the one from your father. So take the one from the parent. If you're at a column level, take the one from the table. If you're at the table level, take the one from the subject area. So just keep in mind that this special behavior can be a bit tricky. So where can you set permissions in the presentation layer? On everything. It can be on a subject area. It can be on the presentation table. It can be on the presentation column. It can be also on a presentation hierarchies and levels. So you can really go into details of what you show or not to whom by application role. Now, the other part that really is interesting with security is data level access. For many people, data level access just means, yeah, I'm setting filters in my analysis. So I create an analysis, I set a bunch of filters, I'm filtering what data I'm showing to my users. So when I build a dashboard for HR, I only show them their own information. When I build a dashboard for sales, I only show them sales figures. That's not security at all. You're just showing and hiding things. It's fake security, forget it. Real data level access, it's really into the tool. It's not something you set on your final screen in your browser. It's something that is closer to the source of the data. So you have to go back really in the RPD, and that's where you set the data level access. It's rules, rules, rules. It's a tons of rules that must match your business rules and your requirement for who can see which piece of the data or not. So one of the things you can do is you can set data level access rules at the user or application role level. Once again, try to avoid the user one, try to stick to the application level one, the application role one, because it's just easier to manage application roles. And the rules that you define are extremely precise. So you can go on the business model and say, on this business model, on this table, on this part, on this dimension, these are the rules that I set. Or on this presentation layer object, I set this kind of rules. For example, here we have a simple rule on the screen. We just do a check if one value is different than something else. But it's not an hard-coded rule. It's not saying, if the user is Gianni or Christian, let them in, please. You say, no, it's a lot more complicated than that. We use a session variable, and this one will be populated by a database query or something coming from a database. So it's fully dynamic, but extremely powerful because it allows you to tailor the security of data in an extremely fine-grained way. So this is really the thing. You set your rules either on the presentation layer object or on the business model objects. You don't set data access rules on the physical layer. That's something else. Forget the physical side. You have to think business or presentation only. Sorry. So this is really an important aspect that many people forget and ignore about data level access. Really, the data filters are extremely powerful and can really do a lot for your reporting needs, analytical needs. There is not only data level access, there is also like query limits. You don't want people to crash your database by running a query that takes 10 days and 200,000 rows or whatever. So you can set time constraints, time restriction, like the query can only run 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or the user can only retrieve 2,000 rows. You are not going to do a dump from my database through OBIEE, so I give you only 1,000 rows. That's all you need. You can also control direct database request, DDR, the thing that you are not supposed to do because you have SQL developer for that. But you can also say, yo, don't do that. So I forbid this user to do it. There is also another aspect that's something that I will say many people ignore or forget, but can be extremely helpful. Inside the logical table sources, you can do a data level access implementation if you want. You have a where clause at the bottom of the screenshot. You see the where block. This is a where condition which will always, 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 and I'm repeating always, be added to your queries. So you just set a condition for the here against using a variable, and this one will always be added to the where clause of every single query. You don't need a filter in your front end. You don't need the user to add a condition to the analysis. The where clause will always be there. This is also a way to do data level access. So this was for the presentation layer and the business layer. What about the physical options that we have? Well, we have a bunch of them. You have the virtual private databases, you have S-based filters, you have named user credential. So if instead of connecting with a generic user to the database, I connect as myself, I will inherit my own permission. These three kind of options require somebody else because the control of what those roles means, it's not me, it's not mine. It's my DBA that said what I'm allowed to do or not in the database. It's the S-based administrator that said this filter, do this, that, and that. So when you use VPD S-based filters or a named user for your database connection, you are in a way delegating the security to somebody else because it's outside of our control. The last option, the connection script, it's a bit tricky because it's something that it will not be visible. If you check your logs of why something happened in a way or another, will not easily find out about this one. So you can do things on connection, really on the connection script. So you can say, when you connect to database, execute this, and that. You can alter your session. You can change your role in the database. For example, if there are tools like eBusiness Suite requiring you to run a specific package to say, I'm this role now, otherwise I cannot see any data. In that case, sure, you can use those screen. Otherwise, try to stay away from the connection script. It's really an advanced thing. It's difficult to track in logs, so that's why it's better to stay away, I will say. If you cannot easily log it, it's easy to forget that it's there and to lose control of it. So you can do it, but let's forget it for a bit. Now, what about data level access in data visualization? Well, things are a bit more complicated just because data visualization doesn't have much option. It's extremely more limited. And it always depends on the type. It really depends on what type of source you are dealing with. The good thing is that the list of possibilities, the list of things you can do in DV for data level access seems to keep increasing and growing release by release. So it's always like, let's keep an eye on it and see what happens. For example, if we have a data set that comes from a SQL query, well, what can we do for access? I can just say this application role or this user can have full control of read, write, and read only. I cannot say this user can only retrieve data for his own department or his own team. That's something that is out of my control. Sure, I have a username and password for database connection, for example. So when I use a connection, I'm prompted to enter a username and password. But again, this one is not really fine-grained as the RPD allow you to go. And when it's about files, so if it's not a database connection, it's just a file, you don't even have those things. I mean, once the file is there, it's there, the data is there, you have either have access or not, you have full control or nothing. You have nothing else, no security at all on files, for example. So data visualization, data access, it's really depend on what kind of connection you're using. For example, with all those connections, it's a lottery. For example, you can have one like Oracle application, allow you to say, sure, it's username and password, but it is I require the user to enter his own credentials. So this is like me entering my own username in my database at the least. But if I look another connection like Spark, nope, it's a shared username and password. It's not my private one. It will be one that will be stored and shared. And it's the same with all the connection. Really have to find out. Some allow you to be more detailed, some not. This was for DV. Now going back to the cloud, Oracle Analytics Cloud, Christian was talking about WebLogic at the very beginning. How in WebLogic you define things, how you define the various sources held up and so on. Well, in Oracle Analytics Cloud, you don't have all that. WebLogic in Oracle Analytics Cloud doesn't exist. I mean, it's there. It's still there to run your tool, but you have no access to it. There we have IDCS. In IDCS, it's a bit like in WebLogic in a way. So you do the same kind of action. So in IDCS, you have to start defining your users and your groups. It's like in the WebLogic console, where you can have users and groups. The groups have a special meaning here because at the very beginning, Christian repeated a few times, web catalog groups are gone. So now you only have application roles. And here we have groups again. Oh, that's weird. I mean, no, IDCS groups have nothing to do with web catalog groups. Don't confuse the two. IDCS groups is just a way to group people together, to not go to the user level to set things, but to have a container of multiple users. And what you do when you create a group is that you go back to your data visualization screen, you click on console, and there inside you find users and roles. And from users and roles, you can show all the users, you can show all the groups from IDCS, users from IDCS, and the application roles. You can edit the members of the application role. So you can say this user is part of this application role, or this group is part of this application role. There's just one little detail. In Oracle Analytics Server, if you use this screen, instead of group, it's called roles. This was the biggest mistake ever on naming that Oracle did, because when you see roles, you think application roles. Nope. Roles means groups coming from IDCS, because Oracle Analytics Server is a tool based on the code of Oracle Analytics Cloud. We inherited the screen from the cloud, so we have a thing called roles, which are not roles, are groups. So if you get confused by a role thing, just check in the name of the list of objects. You will easily find out, oh, those things are actually groups. Yeah, it's a really poor name choice from Oracle. Sorry, I apologize for them. But how do you manage the application roles in cloud or even on OAS? OAS, it's the same thing as in Enterprise Manager in WebLogic. You just open your application role, you check the members, and you can set application roles or users or groups as part of this application role member. And then you have inheritance. And on this one, we are almost on time. I guess we're just like 2 minutes late. So it's already a good result. It was really a quick overview of the security. As you saw, there is a lot of places where you set security. That's why in 45 minutes, you can only have a quick overview.
Excellent. So thanks everybody for listening. Thank you for participating, Gianni. And yes, send us all the questions that you have. We'll take them up in via email or Slack. We'll see about that for the feedback. And tomorrow, meaning 27th of October, again, very early, we will have another session, Gianni and me, about upgrading from legacy Oracle Business Intelligence to Oracle Analytics Server. So if you're interested in that, please join us tomorrow for our next talk. And for today, I say thank you very much. And with this, I hand over to Gianni for the last words.
Yeah, so thank you from my side as well. And just as a reminder, now that you know everything about security, please go doing an audit of your security, because everybody has little shortcuts, workarounds, dirty secrets there inside. So please do this audit, because tomorrow in our upgrade presentation, you will need it. It will help you to have a clear security view.